Okay, today we're going to talk about some common mistakes people make while they're doing any kind of rowing variation. My favorite is the standing one-arm cable row, so we're actually going to use that as kind of a demo just because it's unilateral and it's pretty easy to visualize some of these common mistakes. So first of the 8 is something we call humeral anterior glide. So what we need to remember with respect to the shoulder is as we externally rotate or as we extend, there's a tendency for the head of the humerus to kind of pop forward. So the ball wants to slide forward in the socket. So it's very important for us to kind of take control of where that humeral head is when we do rows. What you'll see with a lot of folks as they go to do their rows is there's this aggressive pull past the midline. And when that happens, the humeral head wants to ride forward. So if you want to use the real fancy terms, the osteokinematics of the joint is that the humerus is extending, but no one's really taking into account the arthrokinematics or how that ball is gliding on the socket. So when that humeral head rides forward too much, you can irritate that biceps tendon. You can wind up with a very loose anterior shoulder capsule. So that's a big problem, particularly in throwers who are already very loose in the front as it is. So when we do our rows, we want to make sure that congruency between the ball and the socket is maintained regardless of where we go. So if we go into a row, really that's our end range right there. My shoulder blade has moved on my rib cage as opposed to just my humerus moving on the socket of my shoulder blade. So again, elbow shouldn't wind up too far behind the body. Now, the second mistake kind of works in conjunction with that, and that's the problem of having the arm too close to the body. So what you can imagine is if my elbow's right in on my sides here, it's going to be more of a tendency just to go into humeral extension, and that scap's going to tip forward, and I'm going to wind up with that kind of loose anterior shoulder again because I'm gliding forward. So one of the common cues that we'll use for folks who wind up too close is just to get that elbow off their side a little bit. Get about 30 degrees of daylight right there between the elbow and the side so you can actually move that shoulder blade on your rib cage a little bit more effectively. All right, so that's number 2. Number 3, forward head posture. What you'll see a lot of times when folks go into shoulder flexion or retraction or anything like that requires kind of a wide excursion of scapular movement, they'll often substitute forward head posture in the process. So, if I go into a shoulder flexion, I don't have good range of motion, I'll shoot my head out and I'll feel like I got to that end range. That doesn't always happen. When you do a row, the same thing can happen. As people will kind of get towards this end range, they'll shoot forward just a little bit to give themselves kind of that feeling of getting to where they need to be. So what we use as a cue is not tuck the chin, but just make a double chin. Some people say pack the neck. I find that people get to the right position when you say make a double chin. Just get right to there and don't be out in that forward head posture. Okay. What you're also seeing right here is I'm actually giving myself a little bit of a cue. What we'll sometimes do with folks is we'll put the hand right on the front of that shoulder, and it works hand in hand with those first 2 mistakes we'll see. You put that hand right on the front of your shoulder, you can feel if that humeral head is popping forward as you pull into that actual row. Okay, so forward head posture, number 3. Scapular depression, though, is another one. You kind of need to see it from the front in order to appreciate what's happening. But I talked a little bit earlier about how that ball and socket congruency is really, really important. You'll hear a lot of people that are told down and back, down and back, down and back. And when they do that, they want to do rows like this. So they pull themselves into aggressive scapular depression. So if we're looking at a right shoulder from the back, in my case from the front in your case, what we're really doing when that happens is we're retracting, but you're cranking into depression. So you think about the lat pulling that down instead of using the low traps and the mid traps and the rhomboids to try to take it towards the midline with a little bit of posterior tilt. So it's the difference between this and this. Okay, so scapular depression is no good, and that usually leads to that anterior humeral glide we talked about as well. So be careful about seeing people that do this and thinking it's okay just because, hey, they normally have this shrugging pattern. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5 is the exact opposite. It's that shrugging pattern. So if I go to do a row and I pull up like this, I can't really get true scapular retraction if I'm yanking myself up with my upper traps. Instead, I'm pulling into elevation. And that's not a pattern we want either because it'll often lead to a little bit of humeral anterior glide. It'll lead to that little bit of a forward head posture. So if someone's naturally very depressed in their standing posture, you may need to cue them to get a little bit of upper trap going. If someone is a grandmother rotator cuff repair, they may already have a really nasty shrugging pattern, so you need to cue them down a little bit more. So there's scapular elevation, there's scapular depression, but there's really no one size fits all answer for everyone. Okay, so that's our additional one. Okay, moving on to our next one, lumbar extension. Okay, it's a fancy way of saying don't arch your lower back excessively. You get into a rowing variation, and a lot of folks will instantly kind of pull up into a lot of extension to try to get that chest up, and then they'll go and they'll do their row. what they're kind of doing is just hanging out on the posterior aspect of their spine. So this is something we particularly want to avoid in young athletes who kind of live at extension already. They can get a lot of tightness in the back. What you also have to appreciate about is, if you're going into lumbar extension, you're taking those lats and you're shortening them over one additional joint. Okay, so you're going into lumbar extension, the lats attach down there, they attach on your rib cage, they attach on your shoulder blade, then they attach on your humerus. So it's this one big kind of gross extension pattern where you're in lumbar extension, you're in rib flare, you're in shoulder depression, you're in forward head posture, and then you're just pulling through and creating that anterior humeral glide. So these are real common ones that we have to get our baseball players, a lot of our young athletes out of. At the other end of the spectrum, we have adult clients who spend all day at the computer and wind up really, really kyphotic. And when you go to a standing one-arm cable row, when you're kyphotic, there's really no place for your scapula to go. You're trying to get some posterior tilt on that rib cage, but the truth is you're so far anteriorly tilted there's nowhere you can go. So people wind up doing something like this. There's just nowhere they can go with retraction. Okay, so being kyphotic, sometimes you do need to just get that chest up, reestablish a good neutral spine position, get them tall so that they're not starting from kind of behind that starting line. But what you also see in folks who are very kyphotic, and you'll often see this with folks who aren't comfortable with the right scapular mechanics, is our last one is just an elbow flexion only pattern. You'll see this quite a bit, and really my scapula isn't moving. I'm doing this strictly with my elbow flexors. So we need to focus on not just getting this elbow flexion taking place, but instead we need to focus on getting good scapular traction. You'll notice I really don't go far past 90 degrees of elbow flexion during a good row, whereas if I do elbow flexion only, I can be in there and be at another 45 degrees or so of elbow flexion. So those are 8 quick and easy things that you can keep an eye on when you do your standing one-arm cable rows, or really any rowing variation, and you'd be surprised at how much they carry over to a lot of your other exercises. So just be aware of posture. The biggest cue I can give you is start from the inside out. So set your core, be aware of how much lumbar extension you're in, figure out where your rib cage is, work on scapular positioning, and then be aware of where that humerus is, and then what that elbow flexion angle is, and where your forward head posture is. Everything takes care of itself.